America's Cold War, Chapter 1, The Demise of Free Security, Part 5. For a while, Roosevelt appeared to believe he could duplicate with Moscow the relationship he sought with the British, that he could incorporate the Kremlin into a partnership dominated by the United States, not only during the war, but after it. He had always been confident of his ability to handle Russia, ever since his decision, shortly after becoming president in 1933, to extend diplomatic recognition to the Soviet government. Woodrow Wilson, as well as the Republican presidents of 1920s, had refused to do that. The bilateral relationship had functioned reasonably well through the 1930s and into 1942. Even when friction arose over the timing of the Anglo-American invasion of France, the president expressed confidence that he and Stalin could keep things on an even keel. In 1943 and early 1944, the administration explored the possibility of tendering a massive post-war loan to the Soviet Union, which the Russians would use to buy U.S. consumer goods. They would pay the United States back with exports of raw material. Like the later Marshall Plan for Western Europe, this plan would likely have had the effect of integrating the USSR into the world economy, effectively forcing it to abandon its autarkic, communist economic system. The idea had considerable appeal in official Washington, where some analysts voiced the hope that Stalin had lost interest in communism during the war, that the wartime impulses of Russian nationalism, together with Moscow's evident need for post-war economic aid, might combine to convince the Kremlin leader to accept a Wilsonian world order and jettison his dreams of socialist revolution. Joseph Davies, whom Roosevelt had appointed his ambassador to the USSR in the late 1930s, regularly advanced this hypothesis, and it was echoed as well by numerous visiting American businessmen, by the current ambassador, W. Averill Harriman, and by Roosevelt's trusted advisor, Harry Hopkins. Stalin, they suggested, had changed. The Soviet Union had become more pragmatic and nationalist, more like the United States. During the war, the Kremlin had even relaxed its long-standing repression of religion. Perhaps Soviet leaders would accommodate themselves to an American-style global system. All of this, of course, textbook example of fuck. All of this was, of course, a textbook example of wishful thinking. Stalin in this period never seriously entertained the idea of voluntarily abandoning Soviet-style socialism in order to enter a global economy defined by American capitalism. But the larger question remained. Even if he rejected participation in an integrated economic order, would, or could, he still cooperate with the United States and other powers to avoid a return to pre-war power politics? Stalin might have assumed what any student of international political economy would assert, namely, that the two decisions went hand in hand. By rejecting economic integration into the capitalist world, the Soviet Union had effectively chosen, as well, to oppose the U.S. politically. Roosevelt appeared to resist this linkage, repeatedly and publicly expressing the hope until his death in April 1945 that the two powers could cooperate after the war. He could not know exactly what Stalin intended, and he retained his characteristic optimism that things would somehow work out. Three actions taken by the Soviet Union during 1944 and early 1945, however, tempered the president's optimism about post-war cooperation. The first occurred at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The Soviets indicated clearly that they were not interested in cooperating to establish an integrated global economy based on the American dollar. U.S. negotiators conspicuously sought to secure the Soviet Union's involvement by offering it a vast post-war loan in exchange for its participation in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Two new institutions introduced at Bretton Woods. The USSR's clear rejection of this bribe, as the Soviets must have regarded it, indicated that the optimists in Washington were, at least on economic issues, clearly wrong. The USSR would remain a communist state, and by necessity therefore an autarkic one, relying upon its own economic devices rather than trading freely with the world's capitalists, led by the United States. Stalin also revealed, in 1944, that he was uninterested in paying even superficial heed to the idea of self-determination, at least with respect to Eastern European nations along the Soviet Union's western border. Eastern Europe had been the launching pad for Hitler's invasion in 1941, and the resulting war had cost the lives of millions of Soviet citizens and caused massive physical destruction. Henceforth, it would be imperative to have friendly, which was to say socialist and subordinate, regimes in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, in Romania and Bulgaria in the Balkans, and most vitally in Poland. Stalin sought to achieve this goal irrespective of the opinion of the Americans, as shown most brutally in his repressive treatment of anti-Soviet elements in Poland. In 1940, the Soviet secret police massacred some 20,000 Polish officers and other civilians in and near the Katyn Forest, an atrocity denied by Soviet authorities until 1990. And in August and September 1944, Stalin halted the westward advancing Red Army on the outskirts of Warsaw to allow the retreating Nazi regime time to annihilate members of the Polish resistance movement there. It is true that Churchill and Stalin had privately agreed to a division of territory whereby much of southeastern Europe would fall under Moscow's control. Roosevelt had also conceded that the United States could do nothing about Soviet action in the East, and he took steps to make sure that nations under Washington's political influence in Western Europe and elsewhere maintained capitalist-oriented and subordinate governments. Roosevelt, and to a greater extent Churchill, understood the Kremlin's leadership's obsessive fear of a German revival and its determination to do whatever was necessary to thwart that possibility, or at least delay it. They further acknowledged that the Soviet Union's huge landmass, 3 times larger than that of the United States and covering 12 time zones, was not easy to defend, and they sympathized with Stalin's desire to dominate the states that separated Russia from Germany, as a way to create a security buffer against another invasion from the West. Indeed, by postponing the opening of a second front until 1944, the United States and Great Britain in essence wrote off Eastern Europe in a geopolitical sense. Their inaction effectively ensuring that this region would be dominated by the Red Army. But Stalin's actions showed more than his unwillingness to go along, even superficially, with the idea of national self-determination. They also showed his resistance to the idea that international politics must change after the war. Roosevelt aimed to develop a collective security regime based on domination by the 4 policemen. That's the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. The primary mission of these 4 actors would be to cooperate among themselves in order to prevent the formation of military alliances and power blocs, which, in Roosevelt's view, inevitably precipitated war. Stalin had some other ideas, though. His actions seemed geared toward creating a bloc in Eastern Europe by resorting to precisely the kind of power politics the 4 policemen were supposed to oppose. Roosevelt accepted this reality. He was not going to cut off relations with the USSR in response to its repression of the Poles, despite what he sometimes implied to do to domestic audiences. What concerned the American president more was the blatant cynicism of Stalin's policies, the fact that if the Soviet dictator gave no more than lip service to international ideas of any kind, it hardly augured well for a new Rooseveltian world order. Ugh, big talking guy, huh? FDR's growing doubts about cooperation with the USSR were intensified by Stalin's insistence that the new Security Council of the United Nations, which was being developed toward the end of 1944 in Washington, D.C., incorporate a veto provision. The 2 leaders went back and forth on this issue over the last several months of Roosevelt's life. The delegates at Dumbarton Oaks had tried to paper over this problem, but Roosevelt's concern revealed that he understood its gravity. The veto would allow any permanent member of the Security Council to prevent any council action, including a decision to authorize the use of force against an aggressor. As a result, any permanent member could itself engage in aggression without fear or reprisal, making the Council's power to prevent war among the world's 5 major powers just illusory. To be sure, Stalin had good reason to insist on a veto, for without one the other members of the council, the 3 other policemen plus France, all of them presumably allied with the United States as part of its New World Order, could gang up on the USSR in the name of collective security. But the suspicion itself put the lie to the idea of great power cooperation. The premise that the Allies could work together, and would work together after the war, and it also signaled to smaller states that they could not rely upon the United States to protect them if they were attacked by one of the Security Council's permanent members. What kind of New World Order was this? The great wars of the 20th century had been initiated not by small powers, but by large ones. If the major powers could not be curbed in the name of collective security, what actual force did the United Nations possess? Roosevelt could not be sure why Stalin refused to go along with his broader plan for post-war peace. Certainly, he had good reason to suspect that the postponement of the Second Front played a central part. He warned Churchill in 1942 and 43 that the USSR would regard the delay as a cynical Anglo-American ploy to exhaust the Red Army by forcing it to bear the brunt of the war against the Nazis. He was also not so naive as to be shocked by Stalin's unwillingness to embrace global capitalism. FDR seemed to believe all along that post-war cooperation could be achieved even in a world of opposed economic and ideological blocs. The president could see why the Soviet Union preferred to rely on its own power rather than the collective security in the event of German resurgence, a factor that FDR clearly acknowledged in Tehran. But Roosevelt regarded the colossal destruction of the two world wars as self-evident proof that the victorious nations now had to build a fundamentally different international order. Stalin was making it clear. Stalin was making it clear to the Americans that he disagreed. Instead of the last line.